In this video, I'm going to give you my thoughts on the X-H2S from the perspective of a photographer. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to discuss something that I never thought that I would do. I am now the owner of a pair of X-H2S bodies, and I'd like to share the decision behind moving from the X-T5 to these bodies, as well as my thoughts on the X-H2S as a photographer's workhorse camera. Now, this won't be a full review discussing all the ins and outs and the features of the camera, because I've already basically done that with the X-T5. Now, the X-H2S is really not a huge deviation in terms of its feature set, unless you're working in video, which I don't do outside of this channel, so I won't be touching on that in any way in this video. The X-H2S is still a Fujifilm camera, but there are some key differences in the way that it operates, as well as how it sort of feels to use that I want to discuss here. Now, I'll be talking about what I enjoy about the camera, as well as what I'd like to see added, changed, or improved in future firmware updates or hardware releases for this series of cameras. Now, before we get going though, there will be quite a bit of constructive criticism in this discussion, and a lot of opinions based on the way that I like to work. So if you came here for me to basically sing the praises of the camera and encourage you to go and buy one, this isn't the video for you. There are plenty of those out there on the internet. Now, I'll be providing the positive and the negative as I see them for the way that I work. Now, if you disagree with any of the points that I make, please do jump down in the comments section below and let us know why they work for you, or how you got around those issues to make them work for you, to ensure that this remains a constructive discussion for the others watching this video, and hopefully provide a little bit more perspective than, you know, a single person like me can provide. Let's start with a simple disclaimer here. I much prefer the ergonomics of the XT series of cameras. Now, the dials on the top of the camera, the smaller form factor, and the three-way tilting screen. Now, those are all far better options for me. That's the way that I like to work, and it's why I still feel that basically the X-T3 was peak Fujifilm in terms of usability. They got absolutely everything right with that camera ergonomically, but it did lack IBIS, and the X-T4 brought along IBIS, but it was a bit of a deviation with its sort of video-centric flipping screen, and then the X-T5 came along and it added IBIS and brought back that screen, and I jumped on it, but in the end the 40 megapixel sensor just became a little bit too much for me. Now, I'm not primarily a commercial photographer. I don't typically shoot 50 images in a session and then work again next week. I'm a family and event photographer, which means that I'm shooting a lot of volume. I typically shoot many thousands of images a week to pay my rent, and despite loving the form factor of the X-T5 bodies, the resolution in the end just became a little bit too much of a burden for me, and unfortunately Fujifilm still neglects to add a small RAW mode like many other camera manufacturers do, so the only way to get a lower resolution is to buy one of their 26 megapixel bodies. Now, the decision to try the X-H2S on for size came when I had a week-long corporate event on the books, and this was a 5-day event where I'd be working 15 or 16 hours a day, and I'd likely be photographing sort of 3,000 or 4,000 images a day and having to make daily deliveries as well. So being able to copy, render, and process those images really quickly was key for that event, and not to mention I basically have to store all those images afterwards as well. I decided to invest in a pair of X-H2S bodies for the event, and if I really couldn't get along with them, I'd be able to sell them again at the end of the week. Now, I chose the X-H2S bodies because they're basically the only sort of professionally oriented bodies that Fujifilm currently offers with a reasonable resolution sensor for volume shooting. And, well, since you see them here, and I don't do these sort of meaningless first look reviews, you can pretty much guess what happened. We're 8 months in now, and I still own them. So let's be clear, I don't like using them, but they are fit for purpose. And unfortunately, there really isn't another option in Fujifilm's lineup, and we'll chat a little bit about that at the end of the video. For now though, let me explain my relationship with the X-H2 style bodies, where it fits into my workflow and where it doesn't. First up, let's chat ergonomics. Now, when I first started looking into the X-H2 series of cameras, all I could see online was this sort of praise for the ergonomics, and honestly, now that I own one, I'm really not sure why. It's a bit of a nightmare when you're coming from other Fujifilm bodies. There are plenty of little, subtle differences that really make it, in my opinion, just a lesser body ergonomically than the traditionally styled Fujifilm cameras like the X-T5. And let's start with the grip. Now, I have sort of moderately sized hands, and I find this grip to just be too big. And I've had no issues with holding the DSLRs of the past, the larger bodies, but a grip of this size on a camera this small is just uncomfortable in my opinion. And I find that holding the camera over the duration of a long shoot results in really, really sore fingers for me, no matter the size of the lens that's attached. Now, of course, using a strap sort of helps to alleviate this over the course of a long day, but I still find myself having to stretch my fingers quite a bit. Now onto the controls. The front and rear dials have lost some of their most useful functionality with the X-H2S. Now, not being able to press them in like buttons means that other function buttons have to be wasted on simple functions that I use each and every day. Now, on most Fujifilm cameras, for example, by default, a tap of the rear dial allows you to zoom in while manual focusing, or when you're reviewing your images to be able to check focus in playback mode. Now, of course, this now needs to be added to another function button for the X-H2S to be able to do those two simple things, since the command dial can't be depressed. Now, I use the front dial on my other cameras to control the aperture of lenses that don't have an aperture ring, like my little Sigma 18 to 50mm, or any number of the third-party prime lenses that I've been testing recently. Now, because the X-H2S doesn't have an ISO dial, there's a need to put that somewhere, and I've assigned it to the front dial, just so that I can have easy access to it when I'm shooting something like a corporate event where I need to change my ISO value quite a bit over the course of a day. With the lowly X-T50, for example, which also doesn't have an ISO dial, tapping the front dial allows you to switch between ISO and aperture value, meaning that you can basically use this for multiple functions. Now, if I want to switch this dial between ISO and aperture on the X-H2S, I now need to waste yet another function button to be able to switch between those two. Now, while it might seem on the surface that the X-H2S has, a lot of function buttons, they very quickly get used up by basic things that could be assigned to the front and rear dials on any of the other Fujifilm bodies. Now, the focus lever is another sore point. Fujifilm has used the same style of focus lever here as on the new GFX bodies. Now, I said it in my GFX 100S review, and I will say it again. It's awful. It is mushy and inaccurate, and for something that gets used in every single image you take that requires sort of accuracy to quickly operate, it's an absolute disaster. Now, the smaller joystick on the XT series of cameras is a far better design and makes moving the focus points around really, really precise. The X-H2S is a slower camera to operate in its basic functionality because of this. And thankfully, Fujifilm didn't do away with the D-pad as well, like they have on so many of their other cameras. So there are still plenty of options there to have customizable buttons, and basically an easy way to work with the menu items as well. So Fujifilm, on any camera where you can fit a D-pad, please put one on them in the future. It beats the joystick hands down for a simple thing like controlling the menu. Now, much like the X-H1 camera, the X-H2 uses a much more sensitive shutter button that requires a lot less effort to depress and activates a significantly softer sounding shutter. Now, the button itself is something that I've got used to, but invariably when I hand the camera to somebody else, they fire off a few mistake shots because they're not used to a shutter that can be pushed so easily. My personal preference still lies with the shutter button of the XT series, but this one isn't bad, it's just different. Now, the shutter itself, however, is extremely quiet, and I absolutely love it. In situations where I need to be discreet, such as photographing the dawn service for Anzac Day here in Korea, I've been able to move around a crowd and take photos even during the minute's silence without anybody noticing me. Now, at this year's service, I was actually complimented afterwards by 3 separate people, thanking me for not interrupting the solemnness of the day like the other photographers at the event. Now, I was told that I wasn't even seen or heard, which is absolutely perfect for an event like that. Now, at other corporate events as well, I'm also the only photographer that's not firing off bursts of clacking noises every time somebody on the podium speaks. The X-H2S shutter is really something quite special when compared to the already quiet X-T5. In fact, let's do a quick test. Here's the X-H2S. Here's the X-T5. And for good measure, here's the X-T50. The experience of working with the EVF on the X-H2S is much improved over a lot of Fujifilm's other cameras. Now, it's large, it's bright, and it's really fast to refresh. And Even the X-T5 feels a little bit like stepping back in time in comparison. It's a real pleasure to work with. It's just easier to see what's going on and to be able to compose images with precision. It's not one of those life-changing things, but it definitely makes a difference. Now, replacing the ISO dial with a custom functions dial and expanding what could actually be saved into those custom functions seemed like a compromise that I was willing to make when I purchased the X-H2S cameras. Now, I'd be working in a different but potentially more efficient way, and that was until I actually started trying to save some things into those custom banks. There are so many settings and features that just can't be saved into those. It seems like one of those customize it, but only in the way that we tell you to, sort of decisions that Fujifilm seems to constantly make. Two simple use cases come to mind for me that I thought would really benefit from this custom functions dial, but in the end didn't because of the limitations of what can be saved into it. Now, the first of those is switching between AFS and AFC. When I'm at a family or couple shoot, I make use of AFS with a single focus point for static shots, and then AFC with a 3x3 zone for moving shots. Now, these things can be programmed into the custom banks really easily on the X-H2S, but Fujifilm forces you to choose a shutter speed to go with them. Now, what that means is that I'm out in the sun and I've adjusted my camera to say f2 at a 4,000th of a second, and then I switch over to my custom bank for tracking. It changes my shutter speed and therefore changes my exposure, which in this case would be 1,000th of a second and would end up just overexposing my image and forcing me to change my exposure again. Now, that is absolutely no quicker than just making all of those changes myself. So in that case, it really doesn't work for me. The ideal way to implement this, in my opinion, would be to allow us to choose whether or not we want to save any exposure settings into that custom bank. That way we could have something that overrides all the other settings without changing our exposure. And we could also have it change the exposure if it is something that we want to. Like, for example, in studio shooting. Now, in this case, assigning a default shutter speed of 1/250th of a second, the sync speed of the camera, makes perfect sense. It allows me to black out the room and be ready to build on top of that with my lights. But the camera has an EVF, which means that in manual mode, which I use when I'm working with strobes, the viewfinder goes completely dark when the exposure is set to black out the room. Now, that's how it's supposed to operate, but it's not very useful in a studio settings. So we need to make use of the preview exposure and white balance in manual mode setting to display a preview in the EVF or on the rear LCD that doesn't reflect the current camera settings. That way I can see in order to compose my images. Now, inexplicably, Fujifilm doesn't allow you to save that setting into a custom bank. Why, Fujifilm, would you not allow this simple setting to be added? Again, it's quicker just to go in and make all of the relevant changes in manual mode than it is to create a custom bank. While I don't expect Fujifilm to make any sweeping changes to the way that this camera functions via firmware, especially now that we're at version 7, I really would love to see the way that the custom banks works updated. Fujifilm, the purpose of a custom bank should be to allow the user to basically put all of the settings they need for a specific situation into a custom bank and access it at a moment's notice, not to force them to only use the ones Fujifilm deems appropriate. I really wasn't expecting the faster readout speed of the stacked sensor in the X-H2S to be of any benefit to me at all. I don't really use electronic shutter unless I'm on a tripod and working in natural light, and the X-T5's autofocus is plenty fast enough for my needs, but the X-H2S is on a completely different level though. Now, I still don't use any of the AI-based focus modes because I find them really unreliable in my experience. So, face detection still finds a person in a garbage disposal cart and chooses the far eye consistently when shooting portraits. So I still prefer to work with single point AFS or zone tracking AFC. They're just more reliable for the way that I work. Now, when it comes to the focus speed, the speed of acquisition, the X-H2S basically walks all over the X-T5. It's hard to appreciate until you actually use the camera, but it consistently locks on faster than the X-T5 in any light. Now, the AFC also behaves in the same way. It's far quicker to react and hold on to subjects than the X-T5 was. It's just faster overall. Now, a couple of caveats here. Firstly, that I don't think this difference will really benefit many people. Now, I often photograph fleeting moments in dark corporate events or young children behaving erratically at my family sessions, and in these cases I really notice the difference, but day to day it's much of a muchness. It's essentially the same thing. And secondly, I'm working with Fujifilm's latest linear motor lenses, and they're snappy and responsive, and I don't actually have any of the older lenses with the other focus motors anymore, so I really can't speak for those. So. In all honesty, I wasn't looking forward to investing in yet another set of memory cards when I ordered these cameras. Now, I've been perfectly happy with the SD cards in my other Fujifilm cameras to date, and I was loath to shell out the big bucks for the CFExpress cards. Now, that was until I actually got them in the mail. Now, I managed to get a good deal on a pair of 512GB cards from ProGrade, and wow, they are night and day. Now, at the event that I actually bought these cameras for, I was able to dump my images at 500, 600, 700 megabytes a second or more sustained copy speeds. And basically what that meant was that I could use my 5-minute coffee breaks to dump my entire session's photos and get the previews rendering while I shot the next session. And by the end of the day, I was ready to make a quick selection and deliver with no copying and no preview rendering left to be done. Now, what that means in my day-to-day shooting is that I can dump my session onto my computer in less time than it takes me to unpack my cameras and put them back in the dehumidifier. Now, admittedly, this is a quality of life improvement that benefits a working photographer on a very tight schedule and won't really affect many people. But still, I'm really impressed with the speed of these cards, both in the camera and when copying things over to the computer. Overall, despite how it might sound, I'm actually really happy that I've moved to the X-H2S for my professional work. Now, I love the additional autofocus speed. It's allowed me to capture some moments that I may have missed before during things like corporate events or family sessions. Now, going back to other Fujifilm bodies just feels a little bit sluggish in this department. Now, as I said, it probably won't benefit a lot of people, but I've really appreciated it. I also appreciate the shutter being so discreet. That's made a huge difference in really quiet corporate settings where I just need to be out of the way of the guests. Now, the biggest change though has been the resolution drop. Now, 26 megapixels is a great balance for detail and file size for the way that I work. And I won't be buying into anything higher than that for my bread and butter work going forward. The couple of things I'd like to see improved in the current body through a firmware update are the ability to completely customize the camera through those custom banks with the freedom that I spoke about earlier, and also to see the autofocus accuracy improve alongside the speed. Now, it still misses from time to time despite being really fast, and those AI functions are still completely untrustworthy. But for the next release of the X-H series, it would be really great to see a slightly smaller grip. But by far my two biggest issues with the design are the non-pressable command dials and also that little focus lever. These are just horrible decisions in my opinion, and they really affect the way that this camera operates. As for my personal work though, I did keep one of my X-T5s as I just much prefer that style of body. Now, it was quite beaten up anyway from a couple of hard assignments that I put it through, and resale value wasn't going to be great. But I am glad that I kept it because when I go out to make photographs for myself, I want a tool that I enjoy, and the idea of taking the X-H2S is just a little bit repulsive to me. It's just not a fun camera to use. So that basically sums up my feelings for the X-H2S. It's an absolute powerhouse, but it's not an enjoyable experience. It doesn't inspire, it's just a means to an end. And what I would really hope from Fujifilm in the future is actually an XT style body with this sensor inside. That would be absolutely perfect for me. Now, I hope this video has offered you a bit of a different perspective on the X-H2S from a lot of the other reviews out there, and that you found it useful. Now, if you have, please do give the video a thumbs up and get subscribed for my upcoming review of the little X-T50 that I showed earlier. So